Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Engaging in Advocacy, Amplifying the Power of Your Story. My name is Heather Held and I am the National Family Support Programs Manager for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. And we are honored to have you all joining us today for this important webinar presented by the PBTF with support from the Coalition Against Childhood Cancer. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few guidelines to review. You are muted for this webinar and your video is disabled, but we do welcome questions during and after the opening remarks. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will not get to every question today, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Today's presenters join us with a wealth of professional and personal experience to share, showing you the power that your story can have. Sarah Milberg is the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy for the St. Baldrick's Foundation, the largest non-government funder of childhood cancer research grants. She also currently serves as a co-chair of the Alliance for Childhood Cancer, a coalition comprised of more than 20 national patient advocacy groups and professional medical and scientific organizations. Sarah joined St. Baldrick's in January of 2020 with 10 years of experience in government relations and politics. Before coming to St. Baldrick's, Sarah worked at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, where she led LLS's federal policy work on childhood cancer and research funding. In that role, she also served as a co-chair of the policy committee of the Alliance for Childhood Cancer. Renee Marsh is CNN's government, regulation, and transportation correspondent, based at the network's Washington Bureau. In this position, Marsh reports on ethics, conflicts of interest, and misuse of government resources at federal agencies across the government. Marsh also covers transportation issues for the network, including the nation's infrastructure. Dr. Susanna Kuntz is the principal at Kuntz Oncology Consulting, LLC, where she serves as a consultant for pharmacy practice, clinical research, and medical education in the fields of pediatric hematology, oncology, and stem cell transplantation and cellular therapy. She works with healthcare professionals and members of the pharmaceutical industry to identify research priorities and to rationally apply cancer therapies in pediatric patients. Additionally, she actively advocates on both the national and state levels for healthcare policy issues affecting oncology research, the care of patients with cancer, and the profession of pharmacy. Prior to starting her firm in 2008, Dr. Kuntz was the clinical pharmacy specialist for the Children's Cancer Hospital at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center for over 10 years. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today our presenters, Sarah Milberg, Renee Marsh, and Dr. Susanna Kuntz. Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you first.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. And it's so nice to be with all of you today. So as Heather mentioned, my name is Sarah Milberg. I'm the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy with the St. Baldrick's Foundation. And was also mentioned, St. Baldrick's is the largest non-government funder of childhood cancer research grants. And we also have a really robust policy and advocacy team that advocates for greater research investments from the federal government. I also represent St. Baldrick's as co-chair of the Alliance for Childhood Cancer. The Alliance is a coalition of more than 20 national patient advocacy organizations and professional medical societies, all working together on policies impacting kids with cancer. I'd like to especially thank our hosts at the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation, one of our great Alliance members, for having me today. So moving into my next slide, advocacy at its core is using your voice to make a difference. And the best part of advocacy is anyone can do it. Anyone can be an advocate. Kids with cancer, cancer survivors, parents and caregivers, friends, physicians, nurses, researchers, volunteers, you name it, they can all be childhood cancer advocates. Advocates come from all over the country, all over the world, from all walks of life, and have all levels of experience. So heading into my next slide, you may be asking, what exactly does an advocate do? And the great news is they do a lot. Advocates can send personalized emails to their members of Congress. They can post on social media, they can meet with their congressional offices in Washington, D.C., or in their home district, or as the last year and a half has demonstrated, via Zoom. Advocates testify at legislative hearings, they speak at congressional briefings, they author op-eds and letters to the editor, They share their stories with elected officials. Anything that involves raising your voice in some capacity is advocacy. And advocacy also allows someone to do as much as they're willing or able to do. And it doesn't just have to happen on Capitol Hill either. For example, an advocate may not be able to travel to DC or to take time off of work to participate in a virtual action day, but that advocate may have time to tweet at their member of Congress or to send a personalized email, and that's great. From walking the halls of Congress to posting on social media, if you're speaking up for kids with cancer, you're an advocate. So the next slide really, I think, sums it up nicely. All advocates, regardless of experience or the way they do their advocacy, do one thing in common. They all share their stories with policymakers to impact public policy. Your story is your greatest asset as an advocate. It's something that's personal to you. It's something you are the true expert in. And so stories add that personal and human element to policy discussions. They're, as I kind of like to say, the why behind any policy proposal. So moving to the next slide, advocacy and advocate stories are best used with a clear goal in mind. What do we want to see happen? What do we want to have change? What program do we want to see developed? What is, the big picture that we're hoping to achieve? And that's a big piece of my role and what the Alliance for Childhood Cancer does. We work with the childhood cancer community to figure out the what. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to achieve here? But then this is where advocates come in. Advocacy is a key part of the dialogue between policymakers and the people they represent. And advocates have a unique and very important role in that process. Advocates and the stories they bring really get to the why of a policy issue, why this matters locally, why this would have an impact. Advocates live in a policymaker's district. They know the unique makeup of their hometown, and they can speak to how a policy would impact people in the local community. And as you can see from the chart on your screen, direct contact from advocates has an enormous impact on policymaker decision-making, because it's not just me, the government affairs representative, coming in saying it's a good idea. It's someone from their hometown who's been impacted by childhood cancer saying, this is how this would impact my family. This is why this is important to me. So moving to our next slide, I thought it might be helpful to give a bit of an example. So each year, the Alliance for Childhood Cancer holds Childhood Cancer Action Days to bring the collective voice of the childhood cancer community to Capitol Hill. For more than a decade, childhood cancer advocates have traveled to DC to share their stories and make targeted specific policy requests, or as we fondly refer to it inside the Beltway, policy asks of their lawmakers. Action Days is one piece of the puzzle in moving policy forward, but it's a really big piece and a really important one. It's often the catalyst for progress. And when we make a big unified splash together, we can make a difference. And for a number of years, we've seen things like the Childhood Cancer Star Act or the Race for Children Act, things like that become law because of things like Action Days getting the ball rolling and getting the unified voice together. But Action Day 2021 looked a little bit different. So going to the next slide. Due to the pandemic, we obviously could not bring people to DC to advocate, but we still could connect people via Zoom. And so that's exactly what we did. This year, the Alliance was joined by nearly 300 advocates from 39 states to hold meetings with nearly 200 congressional offices. Now think about that impact. That is nearly half of Congress hearing directly from childhood cancer advocates in one day. That in and of itself is impressive. And that's the exact type of tidal wave we're talking about when we think about advocates making a unified collective difference together. And even though Action Day looked and felt different this year, advocate stories were still at the core of the event. And each advocate had a why for being there, for taking time away from work, away from their family, to dedicate a day to telling their lawmakers why childhood cancer needs their attention. And as you can see from the pictures on your screen, we had a lot of smiling faces, a lot of really enthused people ready to share their story in whatever format we could make work that year. So going to the next slide, this obviously then begs the question of, so how did we do? Did this work? Did those 300 advocates have an impact? And the answer is absolutely yes. We took our clear, straightforward, unified policy goals, the what of policymaking, and had advocates lead the charge with their stories, the why of the policymaking process. And thanks to the tremendous efforts of the childhood cancer advocates participating in Action Day that day, as well as the hundreds across the country who may not have been registered for Action Day, but still participated in other ways virtually as well, Congress is again on track to do a lot of what we'd asked them to do. So Congress is again really set to provide full funding to implement the Childhood Cancer STAR Act for a 4th straight year and to fully fund the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative for a 3rd year. And that's $80 million for another year that's set to be specially set aside for childhood cancer research. And that's really important and special to recognize. And that's a lot in part because of the work advocates did. The Childhood Cancer Caucus also grew by a 1/3 since Action Day. So again, not only are we getting commitments for funding increases, we're also getting commitments from the people making those decisions to continue to be part of Team Childhood Cancer, continuing to be part of the broader conversation and to make themselves champions for our cause. So again, these what's, the policy what's of securing funding, of growing the caucus, and so on, they need the whys though to make them happen. And that's where Action Day really came in and was so important for this community. Advocate stories impact policy and lead to real outcomes, just as Action Day demonstrates, but as we've been able to see for years before that as well. And so I hope you'll continue to join us in sharing your why. And so just heading to my last slide, I just want to again say a big thank you to PBTF for inviting me today and to inviting our fellow panelists as well. And I'm now going to turn things over to Renee Marsh.
Thank you so much, Sarah. My name is Renee Marsh, and I am a correspondent with CNN, and this is my beautiful son, Blake. The perfect life that my husband and I had came crashing down in December of 2019 when doctors told us that the reason why Blake was having trouble with the motion of his left eye is because he had an aggressive tumor in the center of his brain. That devastating diagnosis, the long, grueling journey for his treatments, as well as leading up to his death this April, all leads me to being right here today and having this conversation with all of you. And this conversation is essentially about how we can use our personal stories, our personal journey to get the attention of lawmakers, get the attention of our communities so that we can make childhood cancer a national priority. And as Sarah said, your personal story is absolutely going to be your strongest tool when it comes to advocacy. It puts a human face on the problem. I'm going to share with you today 4 tips for how you can tell your story, advocate for this issue, but tell your story in a very powerful and impactful way. So we're going to go to the next slide that's going to just kind of give you a sense of where we're going to go over the next 10 minutes. We are going to talk about focus. We're going to talk about timing. We're going to talk about the audience, and we're going to talk about storytelling tools. So the first one that we're going to delve into is focus. And you have to decide, what is the goal of your advocacy? What specifically are you going to be advocating for? So let's go to our next slide. When you decide what your focus is, you are then able to essentially tailor your messaging. You have a long journey that you've experienced, most people who have gone through this cancer journey, but if you can decide what aspect of your advocacy you want to focus on, you can then decide what aspect of your journey best illustrates the problem or the need that you want to highlight. For example, you're looking at this screen here, and this was the very first time that I shared any information about our journey and what Blake was going through on social media. So this was on Instagram. And in this post on the left side of your screen, I discussed about how Blake at 9 months old had just completed his first round of chemotherapy. And the next day, his heart rate ramped up and he was rushed to ICU. His heart stopped beating and they were not able to get a pulse. Doctors realized that Blake had a reaction to one of the chemotherapy drugs that caused fluid to build up around his heart and his heart to stop beating. Blake was on life support for 6 days. I shared this story because I wanted to highlight what I had just learned as a new parent in this cancer journey. And that was just how dangerous and toxic these drugs that are your child's best shot. And so I use my personal story to highlight that in this post here, essentially raising awareness that there aren't many drugs that are made for children for their cancer. And therefore, these drugs that are their best shot at survival come with a great deal of toxicity. So that is one way in that you can look at the big picture of this big issue that is childhood cancer and pick out what aspect of it you want to focus on, and then look at your story and look at what aspect of your personal story can bolster whatever point you want to make. So now let's move to the next slide and let's talk about the audience, because that's really important too. Who is your audience? Who are you speaking directly to? And I know a lot of folks, sometimes their initial reaction is to come up with a one size fits all sort of messaging when you're sharing your story. I personally like to think of tailoring your story to a specific audience. In my mind, advocacy is a lifelong commitment, and there will be plenty of opportunities to engage different audiences at different times. So what you're looking at here is an example of me speaking directly to an audience. And that is so very, very important. Okay, so we have the timing slide up. That's fine. Okay, yeah, audience. So in this slide here, this was written on Mother's Day. This was my first Mother's Day without Blake. And so that was just 25 days after he passed away. And I wrote specifically to women, and I wrote specifically speaking to mothers. And I used my personal story about losing my son and not having him on Mother's Day to draw people in, people with perfectly healthy children. But this is a great example of picking your audience and tailoring your message to that audience, because if you can understand who you're speaking to, you can then identify parts of your story that will really resonate with your audience. So don't be afraid to do that. Like I said, advocacy is a lifelong commitment, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to come up with tailored messaging for a variety of different people, different groups, different audiences that you may have in mind. And it also makes a lot of sense that if you have people within your network who have access to other individuals, aside from moms, for example, you may have a friend who has a blog, and that could put you in front of a whole different audience. That is something that you definitely would want to tap into. And I just want to say, when it comes to audience, the measure of success personally, when you're advocating, in my opinion, should not be just like landing on network news. I think that the measure of success is activating your network within your community, and then building on that and activating your network's family, friends, and neighbors, and so on and so forth. Because we're really going to do this, I believe, on a grassroots level. The next slide that I have is timing, because timing is really everything. As someone who's worked in the news media for a very long time, I can tell you that, you know, if something is relevant, it's timely, it's most likely to get a lot more attention. So it's not, I understand, not always possible to find a hook, but you should absolutely always try. So this is one example of timing and finding a hook when you want to advocate and share your message. So this was written in February of 2021, and that was a time where 24/7, the news cycle was focused purely on the pandemic, because obviously we were really in the thick of it at this point. While we were in the hospital with Blake and he was getting treatment, I saw firsthand the impact of the pandemic on things like clinical trials, on, you know, funds for research, and what that would mean. I realized what that would mean for the long term for these children. So I decided to write an opinion article about how the pandemic was threatening children with cancer. And this specific op-ed was published on World Cancer Day, which was February 4th. So you see what we did there. Timing was crucial. So the news cycle was focused on the pandemic. That's what this op-ed is about. And on top of that, we layered it with the fact that on this day, it was World Cancer Day. So you have two hooks here. So I just urge you, as you're thinking about sharing your story and opportunities in which you can share your story, think about timing. How can you fit it into what the rest of the world is talking about? Because we all care about this issue. But what we want to be able to do is to get everyone to care as a country enough about this issue to activate some change. And I truly think that when you frame your story in a very timely and relevant way, you are more likely to get more attention and more pickup. So think about that as you are crafting your stories to share them with your advocacy efforts. The next slide that I have is storytelling tools. So on the left of your screen is a video that I gave, and then to the right of your screen is a petition that I created. So I talked to you a bit about that Mother's Day article that I wrote 25 days after my son passed away. And within that article, I unveiled the fact that I had started this petition, and it's called Cancel Childhood Cancer. And essentially, overall, if you haven't seen the petition, it calls for making childhood cancer a national priority. And I chose this to highlight storytelling tools. Number one, the video there. If you are using like social media to share your story, videos are always very engaging. It usually gets the most engagement from people, but it doesn't have to be videos. You can write, you can, whatever is your strength. You need to figure that out as well. What is your strength as far as storytelling? Are you a social media person? Would you like write and get a guest article for, or a guest essay for a trade magazine or for a local publication? First, you must figure that part out. And then once you've identified that, then you tailor your message to whatever the medium is. So here I use the video to essentially thank people for signing this petition that I started. And I'm using this as an example because I think oftentimes we think about our personal story, our personal journey with cancer, and that is it. But our storytelling definitely should expand to also lift the veil and include insight on your journey as a parent or as a caregiver who is on this journey to raise awareness. So that's kind of what we're doing here in real time. We continue the storytelling. By this point, everyone knows my personal story with my son, but now they're watching a mother try to essentially change what's wrong with the world by way, hopefully, of this petition. And we lift the veil as far as like, you know, the challenge or the goals that we meet along the way. So in this video, we had just hit 10,000 signatures, and we were alerting everyone who had been a part of this effort that we got to this amazing milestone. And by doing that, we essentially got another boost of enthusiasm behind this petition. So I just encourage us to think like very broadly as far as what advocacy means, what storytelling means, and what that involves. It involves our personal story, but we can engage our audience, our community, our family and friends in other ways as well, which is essentially kind of giving them a behind the scenes look at what the journey is like for your advocacy efforts. So take us along. Like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? And take us along with videos and keep the story going. I think that can be a very effective tool in keeping people engaged and keeping people engaged beyond the 1 week or the one day that you may post on this issue. And just in closing, I just want to say that beyond amplifying our own stories, I really do from the heart believe that it's important to amplify each other's stories as well. Because if we really are going to cancel this disease, it is going to be a team effort. It is not going to be one family. It's not going to be one person that's going to be able to conquer this disease. So we have to just make sure, and this is something that I tell myself all the time, that we never let our personal stories become more important than the cause itself. So it should, yes, we feel the loss. Yes, we do this for the people that we've lost, but in the end, the cause is what's important. And if we kind of never allow our personal stories to trump that, I do think that we can achieve something really great. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Susanna.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me today to be a part of this wonderful webinar. I'm excited to come in and do the closing session, if you will. So what I am going to do in the next about 10 minutes is just try to talk you through on using social media to amplify your story, some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. As you heard earlier, I'm a pharmacist and I'm a healthcare provider. So that's where my story is in the healthcare setting. You just heard from Renee Marsh, and her story is more from, you know, the caregiver side. So we all have different stories. And I think that's what makes this so exciting for all of us to come together. So next slide, just to start everyone off, just to get everyone refocused. Why our story is important. We've heard some of the powerful news stories can be leveraged for advocacy to get the word out. There's two quotes that I want to share with you. The first one is this one by Peter Forbes saying that, you know, stories create community. They enable us to see through the eyes of other people and open us to the claims of others. And I like this because of the eyes of other people. So everyone has, you know, your story to tell, and it's told through your perspective, which is very helpful because we all bring something different and something unique to the table. On the next slide is a quote by Sir Richard Branson. And he says that telling a story is one of the best ways we have of coming up with new ideas and also of learning about each other and our world. So again, it really connects us together, all of our stories, particularly as we string them along. And, you know, each story just adds to the impact that we can have, especially in the childhood cancer community. The next slide kind of goes into, you know, this social media stuff. Is it really, you know, people ask me, is it really worth my time and effort? You know, am I really going to reach people? And the answer is yes, actually. When you look at some of the data that's come out, and this is from Hootsuite that was published earlier this year, looking at the United States specifically in their connectivity, if you will. We have about 332 million people in this country. And when you look at the number of devices, so how many cell phones, how many tablets, how many, you know, laptops do people have? There's 353 million devices right now at the turn of 2021. Well, that equates to more than 100% of the population. And of course, we know not every person in this country has a mobile device. So that tells us that more than one mobile device is the average for the people who actually are utilizing the devices. Internet users, there's 298, almost 300 million internet users in the United States. So the majority of the United States population is connected to the internet. So they have that access to get on social media and be connected through these social media channels. And then as far as how active people are specifically on social media channels, it's just over 70% of the United States population. So people are going social. The next slide says, well, what are we doing? When we go social, what are our behaviors telling us? Almost close to 100% have utilized social media network messaging service within the past month. So it's something that we do pretty regularly. If you go through that, you know, people are actively involved in social media channels. We do spend a fair amount of time. I think some of us probably spend more screen time than we need to or should be doing, but the average in the US population is just slightly more than 2 hours probably more than what we do as far as exercise each day, but people are using social media throughout the day, about 2 hours on average. The number of accounts that people have who are utilizing social media, it's just a little over 7. So a lot of people will find 1 or 2 platforms is not necessarily fitting their needs. So they're either quite curious or they have different goals in mind. So they'll have several accounts that are being active. And we'll go to the next slide. So moving into now, what are some of the successful tips for telling your story specifically on social media? We heard Renee and we heard Sarah talk about it through the eyes of advocates or in-person meetings, say on Capitol Hill. But many of us from day to day are at home or at work. And how can we utilize social media to continue telling our stories or amplifying our voice? Well, one of the first things you have to do is define your goals, and can be different for each person or each family in terms of what you want to achieve. So sit down and ask yourself, by telling my story, what is it that ultimately I want to do with it, or what do I want to achieve? Because that's going to be important in terms of guiding how you tell your story, guiding where you tell your story. So the next piece here is determining your audience. And as Renee has already shown, it's really important to get in front of the right people. So if you have a story, so for example, your goal is to increase research funding for a particular childhood cancer, well, your audience is going to be much different. Say it's going to be researchers, or it's going to be foundations who give out research grants. Then if your goal, say, is to increase, support of a local Ronald McDonald House, then you're going to go more into a different direction. So it's really important to know not only your goals, but also your audience that you want to tailor your story to. The next thing you need to do is to select your platform or platforms. For some people, they like to stick with one because they find it more manageable. Their story is one that just fits best on, say, Facebook rather than Instagram. For other people, they want to share that same story across multiple platforms. So they'll have a Facebook account, an Instagram account, and Twitter as well. So you need to ask yourself, how broadly do you want to get the word out, or do you want to just try to tailor it to 1 or 2 platforms? You want to create the content. So I think it's really important to sit down and be thoughtful in some of the content that you want to put out there. Some people just will do things on the fly. I find myself personally, when I'm starting to post things on social media, I'll give it some thought. I actually will draft some things, in a Word document, to see if I like it, to see if it fits, and so forth. So don't be afraid to kind of have to sit down and revamp or revise your social media posts. I think that's just, something that we all do. Once you come up with your content, then the thing you want to do is to go out and post. Obviously, getting that word out to everyone. So you'll want to be sure that you have, a good amount of things to post, whether it is, 1 or 2 items in a particular, area that you want to talk about. You want to make sure you can follow up. Sometimes if you're telling your story, you might go in, you talk about, a prequel, if you will, like tomorrow's a big day for us, we're having a scan. And then what you want to do, and maybe the next day on the day of the scan, you talk about the experience, and then you might follow up later with what the scan results were. So it depends on, again, how you're sharing your story, how much you're actually posting. Then monitor your activity, seeing what the engagement is, seeing how people respond to your posts. If you find that it's not what you're expecting, you're not getting a lot of traffic, then you may want to reach out to people in your network, as Renee had talked about, asking people, for example, would you mind sharing my story on your social media channels? Whether, if you are a person who likes to use Twitter, can you ask someone who uses Facebook, for example, to share your story? That's going to help you. And you can tailor and adjust the amount of information you're sharing, or how often you're doing it based on the activity. And you can do this through a variety of channels. On social media, you can get analytics, you can get metrics. Some people like just to see, who is it that's actually engaging with me? Do I have, my core group of people I'm looking for? Am I hitting my target audience? And if I am, then I'm on a good course of continuing down the path that I've set. If I'm not, then I tend to have to reevaluate and see how can I really still have time to reach my goal. Do I have to tailor the message differently? Do I need to go toward a different platform or social media experience for people? Next slide. So here's just a couple of pointers for sharing your story on social media. We reviewed these a time or two earlier in the webinar, but the first thing to do is to develop a plan. So some individuals will actually have what they call a social media calendar. So once they determine, who their audience is, how they want to share their story, then they'll develop a plan. How often will they post information? They also will determine maybe key dates. You heard, earlier this year, February 4th was World Cancer Day. So some people will have that on the calendar and will specifically put something out on that day that's tailored to get the attention of people who are also on social media for the same reasons. September, as we all know, is Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. So some people will have a really robust plan in place to go throughout the month of September with specific content. Create engaging content. Obviously, just words themselves can get very bland and old very quickly. As Renee was talking about, using video, using pictures are going to engage people more. People are going to stop and see it. People are going to engage with it, be more likely. They say a picture, says 1,000 words, and that is true. So adding a picture along with your content is going to be very helpful. Just make sure that you have permission of the people in that picture to use. So if it's not just your child or your child and say mother, you may also want to make sure that if your child was with physical therapy, for example, that the physical therapist is aware that you might be using this on social media. Also, hashtags are important. They can link your story to certain concepts, to certain events, and to other people. So don't forget to include the hashtags as well. Some other things to make things engaging, polls. Some people will have, short polls, for example, on Twitter. That often gets people excited and actually engaging with your posts. Engage with others and be a good listener. So if you're posting things, make sure that you're engaging with other people who are also posting as well. So maybe liking what they have to say, commenting on what they just posted, and just increase traffic to your site as well would do that. Connect with others with a similar message. We are all in this community together. We've all heard that, one story isn't enough. We all have to have our own stories weaved together. So we try to connect with one another. So that's what I try to do. I try to connect with other people in the childhood cancer community to help amplify what I have to share. Be courteous, be genuine, and be appreciative. Obviously, social media can be quite ugly sometimes, especially with some of the content we're currently seeing. We call that doom scrolling. But, just be kind. We all have a battle you don't know about, right? We're all facing different issues. So just, if you don't agree with something, you can be very polite about it, but don't, go after someone or attack. And you yourself, when you're sharing your story, just, make sure that you are just staying very positive and very genuine. Your personality will come through in your story, and people will appreciate that. And the last thing I have is be realistic. You can sit down. I know myself, I get very excited, I get very eager, and I think to myself, well, Childhood Cancer Awareness Month is coming up in September. There's 30 days. I can do 30 posts, right? I can do a post a day. I need to be realistic with myself to make sure that, am I really up to that challenge? Some people are very passionate about it. Other people they're passionate about it, but they find that if they, maybe scale back a little bit, kind of the less is more, that actually might garner some traffic more than just trying to continuously put out stuff. So you need to kind of balance what you want to do with your time, your resources, and expectations. Some don'ts. I say don't mix content. If this is about your story, your personal story, it might be difficult if you start interjecting some of the stuff from your professional role as well. People might just, it might get lost if you're trying to mix your message. So you may want to try to just stay on point and stay focused with your story in a particular social media channel. Don't misinform or mislead your audience. We know there's a lot of misinformation out there for a variety of things, particularly in healthcare. So you want to make sure that you're being accurate and honest to the best of your ability. And again, don't be negative or insult your audience. If someone disagrees with you, you can just say politely, thank you for your experience. It's always good to hear someone else's perspective and then move on. And then the last thing is just don't talk the politics. Obviously, when we do advocacy, you have that political feel infused into your story, but you just, keep it middle of the road. You just tweet out to people in representing you and your particular congressional district, but you don't get into a political back and forth with a particular office because your congressman voted on a particular bill. So I just stay out of the politics on my social media accounts. Next slide. So really, does this work? People have asked me, what can you really do? I mean, we heard the power of advocacy. Sarah talked about, we had several people meeting this past April. I was one of them. We across the country, we met virtually, and you saw how powerful that was and what we were able to do. Well, I would argue that social media is a very powerful tool as well. And here's just one example. If we think back to the summer of 2014, so 7 years ago, actually this time in the summer, what was going on, if you can remember? What was the big challenge that was circulating through social media channels? And the next slide will show you. Here's a hint. So it's actually the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. So in 2014, this was a huge success in terms of getting people energized about ALS, energized about the research and funding towards ALS, and increasing an awareness about it. Now, Ice Bucket Challenges were nothing new prior to the summer of 2014. They've been around for many years. And we know that ALS as an organization and all of the work around ALS has been going on for many, many years. So what was it about this that made it so special? The fact that they raised $100 million in research funding in the month of July of 2014. It was because it took off on social media. So a couple people were talking about it. They started to do this challenge kind of in their personal networks, and they were starting to, challenge one another. And then it took off because it hit social media and it went viral, as we say. A couple celebrities started to get behind it, and it went across this country, just like, again, viral, and it went wildfire. But that just shows you how the power of social media can connect all of us. I think a lot of people were jumping into this because they wanted to be a part of something bigger than what they have been at home or in their work up until that time. Next slide. And the last thing I'll impart with you is just remember, everyone has a story. And I hear this from time to time. Again, people's like, well, I don't really have anything to say, or my story isn't unique. Well, it is unique because it's your own story and your own experience told through your perspective. So some of our experiences may be similar, but they're still unique. And I think that's important because the collective voice with all of this is just going to allow us to move forward and to help conquer childhood cancer. And that is my last slide, and I'll entertain any questions that people have.
Thank you, Sarah, Renee, and Susanna for your thoughtful presentations. My name is Kathy Riley, and I'm Vice President of Family Support for the Pediatric Brain Tumor Foundation. We now welcome questions from all of you. Please type any questions you have into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We've received some questions from registration, so I'll begin with one of those. And Renee, I'll start with you. Talk a little bit more about how do you share your story with those who haven't been personally touched by pediatric cancer so that they will listen and engage with our cause?
Yeah, I think that that's obviously the biggest challenge for this community. I mean, it makes it very difficult, the fact that this is such a rare disease, at least medically, that is how it's described. But I think it goes back to what I said earlier, which is once you know who your audience is, you can then, I feel, better size up this individual, what would speak to them? What would resonate with them? Are you speaking to another parent? I mean, I think that even if you don't have a child with cancer, every parent understands the love that a parent has for their child. A parent of a healthy child would understand what it feels like when your kid is sick or has a cold or a flu. You just feel terrible. Well, just imagine that like 10-fold, 100-fold, where, you know, you're in a situation as a parent where your child is sick, but there are no medications that you know that can cure whatever it is that they have. I think when you speak to people on a level that they can understand, it becomes easier to break through that barrier, the fact that they don't necessarily have your shared experience. But if you can find some commonality and kind of really focus on that, I think that that is going to be your best way to kind of speak to their hearts and help them to understand, or even have some compassion to want to join forces with you. So just understanding who you're speaking to and where there might be a commonality, that you can use that as the vehicle to speak to them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Renee. Susanna, one question we received is, what is that fine line between sharing and oversharing? Is there one? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the line is different for each person who's sharing their story. I think that for, as I mentioned about the photos, for example, clearly, you have to make sure that it's within HIPAA, right? So you're not, having a photo with another family member or another patient in there who you don't have the permission to use, or there's medical information that you don't have permission to share. So that would be oversharing. And I think for some people, they feel that having more details, having that intimate journey is important, so people are aware this is what the process entails for that particular family. That's going to be important. And for other people, they rather have the minimal information. And so you can kind of tailor it to, again, as I mentioned, in terms of timing. Some people find that sharing, a blog post 3 or 4 times a week has been very cathartic for them, very helpful for not only them, but also the people who are following along and who are supporting them either back home, or for people to get a really clear understanding of what's happening. So, you can also, I just ask for feedback sometimes. If people, if you're concerned about the oversharing aspect, ask people what they think. If people, say that they're uncomfortable with some of the details that you're sharing, you may want to try to tailor your story a little bit more.
Thank you for that, Susanna. Great words of wisdom. Sarah, I'll turn to you next. How do we connect with others in the childhood cancer community to amplify our voice? Do you have some advice for how we can do that?
Absolutely. So there are a number of different ways. If you, for example, are an advocate in this webinar listening in, the best way is to connect with PBTF staff. They're members of really great coalitions with other organizations that are working collectively. If you are an individual wanting to kind of figure out where your place is in all of this, 2 great coalitions that I always love to give credit to: the Alliance for Childhood Cancer, which I'm a part of, but also the Coalition Against Childhood Cancer is also a great resource too. Those are the 2 main collectives in the policy space in particular, or at least working on Capitol Hill on policy issues, working on these issues. And so if you want to be part of that unified messaging, those are 2 great places to start. Another great resource as well is if there's a particular disease type or other nonprofit that you're connecting with specifically, oftentimes they have policy and advocacy resources as well and can help get you started.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. And I just want to invite our other presenters, if you have anything in addition that you want to add to any of the questions, feel free to jump in. This is a very organic space. So if there's something that you feel like you want to contribute, please jump in and feel free to do that. Renee, I think I have an additional question that I'd like to ask you. We received a question about reaching a broader audience using different media platforms. Have you found a particular platform to be the most impactful way to advocate? And if so, could you talk a little bit about that?
I think that we should strive to access what we have access to be perfectly honest, because here's the thing, we're not all going to have access to the same levels of like media that, like for me, for example, I am obviously going to have access to my employer, CNN, and I have many friends who work in media, so I'll have access to that. But not everyone is going to have that access. And I think that that is okay. I think that the focus really should be accessing all of your network's resources. And I think that when we do that on a grassroots level, and that is the focus, we will get the other attention. But I think it starts on the grassroots level. So to answer your question, I think the easiest thing that we all have access to is social media, because I really do think that that is probably one of the most powerful tools right now. I know from like journalism perspective, I mean, oftentimes you will see that things that you see on social media oftentimes have a great deal of control over the news cycle, and has actually changed the way we even cover the news, because it causes the cycle to move a lot faster because social media is so instant. So I think this is something that we all can do because we all have these accounts, social media accounts. I honestly think that that is your number one tool. And if it is done in a very effective way, and it is done with an effective strategy, meaning the entire community kind of working together to share their messaging. I see, as a new person in this space of advocacy for childhood cancer, the use of a hashtag can be very, very helpful, because it helps to almost group all of the messaging from a variety of people into one place. And how wonderful if you're all of a sudden trending cancel childhood cancer or go gold or any of the other hashtags, that will get you the national media attention that you're looking for, or get lawmakers' attention that you're looking for. So I think the focus, it's a smart strategy to focus on social media, and it's so easy to do because we all have access to it.
Yeah, great words of wisdom. Thank you. We received a question in the Q&A portion of Zoom, and I'll read it. And Susanna, I'll ask you to address this question, and then Renee and Sarah, if you've got anything in addition to add, please feel free. The question is, early on in our family journey, I had a lot of response to our social media posts. Now, 5 years in, I will post something that I find is very important and get little or no response. How do I not get down about that?
So that's a great question. And I caution people sometimes when we talk about engagement and you look at people who, how many likes, how many reposts did you have? Don't just rely on that metric in itself, because sometimes you might have fewer engagement, but they're more influential people, or people who can spread it a little further. I would also ask, are you changing your message in terms of, is it still like the same type of content? Do you want to try to switch some things up? Do you want to, go back to a couple posts like, hey, this is a throwback Thursday to when I posted something 3 years ago. And the reason I'm reposting is because I found this in the, just the other day that I think is very important, and it's very similar and it links the two. So I think that's very helpful. Also asking people their permission, or asking, just help me. This is something that's important to me. It relates to my child's journey with cancer. Would you mind sharing it with your network? Would you mind commenting? Getting some people to maybe start the conversation, that also may help.
Yes, thank you. And that addresses sort of connecting with that larger community to amplify your voice. So thank you for that. I would be remiss, Sarah, if I didn't ask you, while we have you, a question about what legislation is in the works currently that needs our voice of support?
Absolutely. And I love that question because the answer is always a multitude of things. So first and foremost, what at least my priority is, and the Alliance's priority and St. Baldrick's priority, is finalizing funding for our priorities for this upcoming federal fiscal year. The federal fiscal year ends on September 30th. So October 1, that clock kind of starts all over again, and we're hoping to have our resources again secured. As I mentioned, we're on track to again have $80 million set aside specially for the Childhood Cancer Star Act and the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative, both of which are really important efforts happening at the National Cancer Institute. So that is priority number one, is getting that finalized. I think we're well positioned, and it's kind of up to the broader appropriations process on Capitol Hill, but that is priority number one in my mind. A few other things are kind of percolating as well. The Gabriella Miller Kids First Research Act 2.0 is gaining support and has been introduced in both chambers of Congress. So that is one active effort going on right now that absolutely warrants more support. And then just to preview kind of the year ahead, the Childhood Cancer Star Act, which for those who don't know is the most comprehensive childhood cancer bill passed in history, is nearing its expiration date, believe it or not. It was signed into law in 2018 for a 5-year window. So 2022 is kind of our last kind of real chunk of getting some of this work done. So we're within the Alliance working on legislation to reauthorize the STAR Act, hoping to have that in early 2022 to share with the community, working again with wonderful champions on Capitol Hill. So that's about a 4 or 5 month preview of something to look forward to.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Sarah. We are unfortunately reaching the end of our time together. I want to thank Renee Marsh, Sarah Milford, and Susanna Coons for their time today and for sharing their expertise, for sharing your personal experiences and your resources with us. Thank you also to the Coalition for Childhood Cancer for your support for today's webinar. And I also want to thank you, our attendees, for your participation. So many thoughtful questions were submitted at registration, and we thank you for that. We invite you, you can see on the slide here, we invite you to join us for the Cancel Childhood Cancer Campaign. This is a collaborative effort between the PBTF and CAC2 and is an ongoing effort through July and August. Your active participation will help make childhood cancer a national priority. You can sign the citizens petition. You can change your Facebook frame to Cancel Childhood Cancer frame and share this information with your networks to encourage them to do the same. And you can find out more about this by going to the PBTF's website. Additionally, the PBTF is joining the fight to cancel childhood cancer by inviting families to go head to head for Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. By teaming up with the largest patient advocacy funder of pediatric brain tumor research, you can help us lead the charge against the deadliest and most common form of cancer in kids under 15. For more information on how you can go head to head, you can visit our website, which is curethekids.org. So we will be sending you a link to this recording of the webinar, and we'll send you slides at the email address you registered with. And then finally, the PBTF is here to help no matter where you are in your journey. Please reach out to our family support team at the PBTF if there's anything we can do to help support you. And thank you all for attending this important webinar today. Have a great day.